All right, welcome back. It's actually been a while since I've recorded something here, so I wanted to chat today about how to reset your relationship with food. And before we dive in, I'm going to share with you actually 7 tips on how to do this. But before we dive in, I always want to share the resources that I offer for free to help people, even beyond what I share here, because of course, actionable tips are great, and I love what I'm going to share with you today. But sometimes it's helpful to have a few more things that are even personal to you. So if ever you would like to connect with me one-on-one for a chat, I offer anybody that wants to a complimentary 30-minute chat with me. You can just go to this link here, freedomnutrition.rocks/let's chat, and book a time to chat with me. And what you see is what you get. You'll be chatting with me. And we'll just talk about you, your goals, where you want to get to, where you feel stuck. And you'll leave that call with more clarity than I think you've ever had before. You'll have a conversation maybe around weight loss like you've never had before. So definitely want to share that opportunity with you. And of course, I do have a free book that I share with people called Crush Your Cravings. So anybody that might be struggling with something like that, again, freedomnutrition.rocks/book, where you can sign up, enter your email address, you get a free copy there. So welcome to that. And of course, a free 7-day challenge. In fact, I have 3 of them. But in particular, I think because we're talking about relationship with food today, probably the one that's most pertinent would be the end emotional eating. So if you go to freedomnutrition.rocks/7-day challenge, you'll see where you can go there to sign up for that free challenge and where to get some bonus resources as well. So as we're talking about earlier today, we're going to talk about how to set food boundaries. And I feel like this is kind of an interesting topic. It's one that we maybe don't think about a lot when it comes to our relationship with food. And speaking of which, I want to ask this question. Whenever I do these videos, of course, I always like to ask questions, reflective questions for you to think about while you're listening to what I'm sharing with you. And how do you feel about your relationship with food? Now, I know for me, I used to have this very, very strained, tenuous, guilt-ridden, really difficult relationship with food where, it was almost like torturous to eat, because on the one hand, food played this really crucial role in helping me to regulate my emotional state. Not really a good place to be. But on the other hand, I knew that my eating behaviors were causing me to gain or to maintain the extra weight that I was carrying around. So I had a really difficult and tortured relationship with food. And I hope that what I share with you today is going to help you to change that if that's something that you have struggled with in the past. And so what we could say is eating well can undoubtedly be a struggle at times, right? Particularly, we live in a world where we're surrounded by this abundance of what I call emotional anesthetics, or all-time favorite comfort foods, right? And so I think really for many people, just setting simple boundaries can be helpful in establishing and maintaining a balanced relationship with food. And really what I'd like you to take away from this today is just feeling more confident, knowing how you can set yourself up for success. So not just, what, but how, with these 7 tips. And so the thing that I'm like I said, I wanted you to reflect on is, how do you feel about your relationship with food? One of the things I think about here is when walking down the aisles of a grocery store, that's a common scenario. Do certain foods call your name? Have you ever used that expression? Like my wife sometimes says, that thing was winking at me. What about if they're in the pantry at home? If there's certain foods there in the pantry at home, do you feel like they're, do you feel like they're calling your name, reaching out to you saying, hey, you should come eat me? I always like to also reflect on, if it feels like something is quote unquote calling my name, what is it promising me? I think that's a really interesting thought. What is it promising me if it's calling my name? And often it's maybe a changed emotional state. You will feel better if you eat this in some way, shape, or form. And so thinking about that, thinking about maybe what you might have in your pantry or things like that. What is a food? Here's another question for you. What is a food that you have a difficult time regulating your consumption of? It's a really interesting one to think about. Is it chips? Is it chocolate? Is it soda? Is it cookies? Is it cakes? Anything that's sort of carbohydrate related? Is there a particular food or a few foods that you feel are kind of a vice for you? And, I want to reassure you, because no matter where you are in your health journey, I want you to know that this is common and it's completely okay to have some foods that are difficult to regulate, and maybe to, let's say, occasionally find yourself on the verge of giving in, or maybe sometimes even feel out of control with what we might call red light foods, those kind of foods that they're just, you start eating them and you feel like I can't stop. And so again, I go back to this, when we can set simple boundaries, it can help us to really maintain this healthy, balanced relationship with food. And now when it comes to setting food boundaries, I think it's really important to also focus on your like, pardon me, your mindset as well as your environment, and we're going to touch on those two things as well. So I'm going to share some tips around mindset as well as some tips on how to set up your environment for success, because a big part of what I do and the work that I do and and how I try to encourage people is really, I like to call it like brain-driven weight loss. We really want to focus on our brain, how our brain works, and how to work with our brain instead of feel like we're fighting it. So for me, of course, this is a fascinating topic. But knowing how our brain works means that we can really set ourselves up for success in multiple different ways, so it doesn't always feel like a struggle. And I think that's the place that we want to get to, where it doesn't always feel like we're engaged or stuck with this tug of war, this emotional tug of war with food. And so thinking about that, let's talk about our internal environment, excuse me, and really like how to manage our mindset around this. And so the first thought that I had here was really not to forbid any foods. And I think this is an interesting one because we live in a world where it seems like there's a lot of, like fad diets and things like that involve like slashing something entirely. Now, of course, if you have a genuine food sensitivity, a food allergy, something like that, like, yes, maybe that's a situation, maybe like a medical type situation where you can't consume that food. That's a different situation here. So what happens when we forbid food is we're essentially putting it on a pedestal. We're saying this food holds power over me that I'm unable to, like I'm almost I don't want to put it this way. I don't know a better way to put it really at this moment, but like I'm almost a victim to this food. This food holds power over me. And so when we put it on the forbidden list, what we're doing though is we're actually making it more attractive, because it's like, well, this food gives me something really powerful, so I have to put it on this pedestal and I have to restrict it, because otherwise, if I try to consume it, I just go nuts, And so, well, are there any foods on your forbidden list? Because I really want to see if I can encourage you to adjust your thought processes surrounding food. So instead of completely restricting certain foods, maybe consider giving yourself permission to eat all foods. Now, this can really scare people, right? Many times permission in and of itself is enough to give you the power to distinguish between, like, when you really want a certain food and when you might want something because like you shouldn't. We often fall victim to overeating when we think about certain foods as being like forbidden or bad or wrong. That's when, and when we put that artificial restriction in place, that's when things can really start to break down. So the second one that I was thinking about here, it seems really, really almost like too simple, but it's pause and take one slow breath each time you sit down to eat or you go to eat something. Take one slow breath to center yourself. Because I think very often we live in a world where it's so easy to get caught up in that mindless eating. And so maybe when we take that, that moment to pause, we can really ask this question of like, am I hungry or am I eating this for another reason? And even think about your eating style. Do you eat fast or do you eat slow? So, just taking that moment to ask yourself, like, check in with yourself. What are you truly feeling before you go to eat something can really help you identify the times when you're eating for reasons other than genuine physical hunger. I like to call it like above the neck hunger versus below the neck hunger. And so maybe something to reflect on here is like, what are some reasons that you might eat besides hunger? So some common triggers for eating other than hunger might include like boredom, anxiety, stress, habit, tiredness, loneliness. So ask yourself like what you're really feeling. And then when we identify what we might be feeling, we can also then ask, well, is there other ways to address what I'm asking food to do for me? Because if it's not hunger that's driving the urge to eat, maybe we can do something different to address what we're feeling that doesn't involve turning to food. So the third one that I was thinking about here was this idea of eat to feel satisfied. Again, a really interesting one, because I think so often we eat like far beyond that. When we, or we, especially like morning and like maybe breakfast and lunch, we really, really restrict ourselves. But if we give ourselves permission to feel satisfied with each meal that we eat, to not always feel like we have to be restricted and in a straitjacket, we're much less likely to snack mindlessly between meals and more likely to kind of eat with intention. Because when we leave the table or wherever we're eating still feeling hungry or unsatisfied, we're more likely to be vulnerable to feeling maybe out of control with afternoon or late night snacking. And so this kind of ties in the fourth thing that I was thinking about here, which was to eat and enjoy, like with intention. So eating food is genuinely enjoyable. It's genuinely pleasurable. And pardon me, as such, we want to eat with intention. So let's say, for example, you are going to eat something indulgent. And I don't like to call it like cheap foods or anything like that, just something indulgent. How do you feel about eating maybe that food that you have a hard time regulating your consumption of? Do you feel guilty? Do you feel stressed? Do you feel relaxed? What indulgent food do you like to consume? So I was thinking about like the next time you're faced with, let's say, a favorite red light food and the decision to eat it. So let's just say, for example, there's this bar of chocolate and you've chosen, like, I'm going to eat this bar of chocolate. Okay, if you're going to do that with intention. You want to acknowledge, I'm not eating this food because my body needs it. I'm eating it because I want to enjoy it. I'm eating this indulgent food. So how can we do this? Well, get rid of distractions. So eating chocolate while watching a movie means you're not fully enjoying eating that chocolate, right? We want to take in the, I guess you would call it like the sensory experience. Like, and maybe chocolate's not a great example, but like thinking about how the food looks, how it smells, how it tastes, how it feels in our mouth. You know, I like to maybe sometimes eat chocolate chips and try, and I don't always do this, but like eating them like one at a time and like really tasting them and tasting that chocolate, you know? And so another way to enjoy this is to give yourself a specific portion. You know, maybe put it in a plate or put it in a bowl, but just eating it with mindful intention and then pausing to really just kind of check in with yourself. So just to tie together, this is some of the more mindset related stuff. And then we're going to go into environmental factors here. But number one was not to forbid any foods. Number two was to pause and take a slow breath. Here, I call these up again. Not to forbid any foods. The second one was to pause, take a slow breath before we go to eat. The third one was eat to feel satisfied. So genuinely, you're allowed to feel satisfied at the end of a meal. And the fourth one here was to eat and enjoy, like with intention. Now, what we could also say is mindset is really important, but there are ways that we can make our life easier by changing our environment as well. Because our environment can also unconsciously nudge us to make decisions. And so how could we potentially optimize our eating environment? And I want to share 3 ideas with you. But again, a question I want to ask is, do you feel like your home environment supports healthy eating? Or does it nudge you towards eating junk food or unhealthy food? So when we think about that, the first thought I had here was, maybe keeping kryptonite foods out of sight. So kryptonite foods, red light foods, whatever you want to call them, those, you know, it's never like no one's kryptonite food is broccoli, right? Let's call it what it is. But like, okay, maybe we need to keep it out of sight temporarily. If you put a bowl of M&Ms or a box of cookies or whatever on the counter, every time you walk past it, you're going to want to eat it. And so we can, and it's like an unconscious thing that we don't even think about, right? So, for example, I often remind myself that it's easier to say no once in the store than 100 times a day at home, right? If something's at the store and I have to get up and go and get it and so on and so forth, like that's a lot more effort than walking past it every multiple times a day and trying to say, you know, no to it. So, you know, if it's chips, maybe you put them on the highest shelf in the pantry. Maybe if it's like cookies or other like baked goods, you know, and you want to save them for special occasions, put them in the freezer, store your chocolate in the basement. The point is, you know, not saying don't eat these foods, but kind of don't have them available to you like every moment of every day where you're constantly thinking about whether or not, because this is where, again, our environment can nudge us to overeat because we're constantly reminded to consume it. Now, maybe you're not really deterred by the out of sight approach, if we'll call it that. You know, maybe you put a food boundary in place and say, well, I'm only going to enjoy these foods away from home. And I like to, you know, I call this like not running with a sprained ankle. So I know we talked about like not forbidding any foods, but we don't want to go to the other extreme where it's like, well, I can just eat with reckless abandon as much as I want of these foods. We want to recognize that, like, obviously, what would I say, like, you know, reckless consumption of this isn't going to help you. And so maybe we put a food boundary in place and we say, this is not a forbidden food, but I'm only going to eat it when I'm outside my home. You know, something like that. And taking this approach can actually make indulging in your favorites like more intentional and more special, really, but in a good way, instead of on a I'm restricted, I'm not allowed or not permitted to eat this. The other next one I was thinking was like these snack pit stops, as I guess what I would call them. Do you have excuse me, like do you have like a go-to place where you go when you've got the munchies? Whether it's a local corner store or something like that. When you leave your house, if you pack maybe like a yogurt, some string cheese, some nuts, some fruit, something for like kind of on the go snacking, then when you sort of get the urge to eat, you're less likely to maybe pull into that coffee and donut shop or something like that. So if you have some reasonably healthy options ready, you're less likely to, from the gas station or the convenience store or the vending machine or whatever, like grab that bag of chips or candy bar, or bottle of soda, that kind of thing. So having some nourishing, satisfying snacks to eat can kind of make a difference between, satisfying snacking and sort of out of control eating. And the last one, I guess this is point number 7 that I was thinking about here, is consider a less is more approach. So let's say if you have trouble maybe regulating your consumption of like all junk food, maybe don't have like, cookies and candy and chocolate and cake and chips like in your house all at once, because maybe one day you're not craving chips, but you're craving chocolate, or one day you're not craving cookies, but you're craving, so on and so forth. At any given time, you're probably going to be craving one of those and maybe always feel like you're fighting temptation. And so many people feel like, less tempted and more sort of in control when they don't have to feel like they're constantly fighting temptation, or keeping these sort of tempting foods to a minimum. And then, of course, keeping plenty of wholesome, nutritious foods on hand. So when you open your fridge, I guess also think about it. I talked about the pantry, but when you open your fridge, what greets you? Is it junk food, or is it, do you keep healthy food kind of at eye level? Next time you're in the grocery store, actually observe, where do they put the junk food? What food do they put at eye level? Of course, look at the cash register when you're checking out. Like it's even like self checkout, you have to walk down this long lane of like all these impulse purchases of like, various chocolate bars and gummies and stuff like that. That's not by accident. It's to make you just want to impulsively grab those things, right? So we think about like stores know how to basically like hijack our brain with this kind of stuff, and so we want to work with our brain instead of against it. So really, again, to recap what I was just kind of around our food environment, you may need to keep kryptonite foods out of sight, so you're not always having to feel like you're fighting temptation. Stash them somewhere where you're not going to see them 100 times a day. Avoid snack pit stops by having some healthy snacks on hand if you are a snacker. And then really this less is more approach. Don't bring home like 8 different kinds of like tempting junk food that you're going to want to indulge, because you're just going to make your life harder. So to kind of tie all this together, I guess all in all, what we could say is like the key to creating like mentally and physically healthy food boundaries is to be your own advocate, right? Because no one is more interested in your health than you, or no one will be more interested in your health than you. So you really have to be your own best advocate. And maybe for some people they find it easier to have all their foods around so that they feel secure knowing if they ever want it, it's there. But others find it helpful to limit them. So knowing like what works, and more importantly, what doesn't work for you, I think is really key in helping you manage your relationship with all foods. So once again, I want to say just thank you for tuning in. I really hope you find this helpful. I'm hoping that you're inspired and encouraged as you just take some ideas. And of course, of these 7 tips, you don't have to apply all of them all at once. I really hope that maybe there's one thing that you take away from this, one little adjustment you make, and then maybe you come back later and you make another adjustment. We don't have to adjust 7 things at once, but really just, I want you to maybe come away from this feeling a sense of confidence around your relationship with food, or that you can safely introduce these boundaries and really forge a stronger, more healthy relationship with food. So once again, I want to share with you those resources just before we wrap up here. If, for example, hey, you want to talk about some of these or what this might look like to put into action for you personally, you're welcome to book a free 30-minute consultation with me, where we can chat about how do we take this information, these tips that I've shared, and personalize them to you. So freedomnutrition.rocks/let's chat. Of course, if you want a copy of Crush Your Cravings, because maybe there's just some foods you struggle with and you want a little more detail around what that might look like, freedomnutrition.rocks/book, you get a copy of that. And if you'd really like to take it to the next level, you can try one of my free 7-day challenges. You go to freedomnutrition.rocks/7-day challenge. All right, thanks so much for tuning in again. Really hope you found this helpful, and look forward to seeing you next time.